I'm Jim Strick, the chair of the STS program here. And for those of you who are coming to your Darwin Day talk for the first time, this is the 17th annual Darwin Day lecture, which we try to do on the Friday closest to Darwin's birthday each year. Darwin was born on February 12th, 210 years ago. The Origin of Species came out 160 years ago. And we have talks that are broadly related to evolutionary thinking, the history of the Darwinian theory, history of the reception of the Darwinian theory, in this case, evolutionary psychology. Our guest today is from Franklin and Marshall. Josh Rottman is Assistant Professor of Psychology and of Scientific and Philosophical Studies of Mind here at F&M. He directs the Developing Moral Values Lab here. He received a BA in Cognitive Science from Vassar in 2008, a PhD in Psychology from Boston University in 2015. Josh's research lies at the intersection of social cognitive development and moral psychology. His work primarily focuses on children's acquisition of moral norms, the impact of storybooks on moral development, the role of disgust in moral judgment, something I think we all need to learn more about in the last couple of years, and cognitive precursors of environmentalism. We've had him speak a number of times to our Environment and Human Values class about this research. He's published in a range of peer-reviewed journals, including Emotion, Cognition, Child Development, the Journal of Experimental Psychology. His work's also been featured in The Atlantic and Through the Wormhole with Morgan Freeman. At F&M, Dr. Rottman teaches courses such as Origins of Moral Thought, Collaborative Research in Moral Psychology, Nature Nurture, and Minds, Machines, and Morals. Really looking forward to hearing his talk today. Josh Rottman, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, for the introduction. For people still coming in, there are plenty of spots at this table up here. And it's really an honor to be here today and to have been asked to do this. So thank you so much to Jim and the others who invited me here. Darwin really is my intellectual hero. He's such an incredible person, and it's really amazing to be able to give the talk that's in honor and tribute to him. So in part in honor of Darwin's birthplace, England, I'm going to show you a brief clip to start off this talk of a British game show.
Is serious, life-changing money. Your jackpot today is £100,150. You have one final decision to make. We're now going to play split or steal. I know you're the last two people in the country I have to explain this to, but you have two final golden balls. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You each have a golden ball with the word steal written inside. You will make a conscious choice of choosing the split or the steal ball. If you both choose the split ball, you split today's jackpot of £100,150 and you go home with £50,075. If one of you splits and one of you steals, whoever chooses the steal ball will go home with £100,150. And the person who chooses the split ball goes home with nothing. If you both choose the steal ball, you go home with nothing. Okay? Before I ask you to choose, I want you to look at your two golden balls and make sure you know which is the split ball and which is the steal ball. This is very important. Make sure you don't show each other. Before I ask you to choose, I think you have some talking to do to each other.
Stephen, I just thought they weren't puppy dog tears and they were real tears and you were genuinely going to split that one.
I am going to split this. That's 50,000. it's unbelievable. I'm very, very happy to go on with 50,000. If I stole off you, every single person there would run over here and lynch me.
There's no way I could, I mean, everyone who knew me would just be disgusted if I stole.
When people watch this, they're not going to believe it.
Please.
I can look you in the, Sarah, I can look you straight in the eye and tell you I am going to split. I swear down to you, I am going to split. Okay.
Would you buy a used car from this man?
We'll see. Sarah, Steve, choose either the split or the steel ball now. Hold it up.
We're going on with 50 grand each. I promise you that.
Split or steel? In this game. Congratulations, Sarah. You have just won 100,150.
Ouch.
So, survival of the fittest. Not sure, is this on? Guess not.
I need to turn it off and back on again.
So, basically what this shows is that, in general, being moral is not going to lead to the best outcomes. Some of you might recognize this as a version of the prisoner's dilemma. And this kind of situation where people who don't act morally end up on top, the fact that nice guys tend not to finish first, but rather finish last, has really indicated to a lot of people that altruism might be in some ways at odds with the kinds of principles of evolution that we often talk about, of this idea of survival of the fittest, and basically doing whatever you can to get the most resources and outcompete others and really get on top. So this question of whether or not morality defies evolution is something that Darwin himself really struggled with quite a bit. And in particular, he struggled with this in a book he wrote 12 years after On the Origin of Species, a book that's called The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. And in this book, he laid out a possible theory of the evolutionary origins of morality, but was very tentative about this and noted that it's extremely doubtful whether the offspring of the most sympathetic and benevolent parents or of those who were the most faithful to their comrades would be reared in greater numbers than children of the selfish and treacherous parents of that same tribe. So it just seems intuitive that the more selfish you are, the more deviant, the more scheming you are, the more likely you'll be to outcompete others and be able to survive and reproduce and pass on those selfish, treacherous genes to your offspring. This question continues to plague many people who think about evolution. Thank you very much, Melissa. So for example, Richard Dawkins, who is another person who's one of the most prominent neo-Darwinians, wrote a book a little about 30, 40 years ago called The Selfish Gene, in which he also really struggled with this issue. And he suggested that we should try to teach generosity and altruism because we're born selfish. That we need to understand what our selfish genes are up to, and only then can we upset their design. So it's only by kind of transcending or overriding our genetic impulses that we will be able to be moral creatures. So it just seems, again, from all of these writings, that altruism presents a huge problem to thinking about where morality might have come from. And in general, we often think of nature as red in tooth and claw. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Sorry.
Yep, that's great. And we see a lot of competition in nature. We often see really aggressive creatures ending up gaining dominance and being very successful members of species. And so, again, morality and altruism seem to present this huge counterexample to natural selection as being the origin of many traits that we see. And yet, there is also quite a lot of evidence of altruism or cooperation in nature. So for example, we see a lot of symbiotic relationships between species. So for example, cleaner shrimp work with other fish to take risks of their own lives, hope that they won't be eaten, to clean out the mouths of other fish, and those other fish benefit from this. Of course, the cleaner fish do as well because they're getting food. But the fact that we can find this kind of cooperation is really striking. And we see this all over the place. So going back to the African savanna, we see meerkats being sentinels and sending out alarm calls that warn other meerkats that predators are around. Our other primate ancestors, cousins, even though they can be very aggressive, also have certain cooperative inclinations. And especially in humans, we see so much evidence of sharing and fairness and cooperation and altruism. And around here we can see groups of Amish individuals working together to build barns and houses. And this kind of working together, this kind of large-scale cooperation, was really difficult for many evolutionary scholars to explain. How could this possibly work if you're going to be giving up certain kinds of resources, taking a whole day out of your time to help build a house for somebody else that you're not going to get to benefit from, that you're not going to get to live in? How could that possibly allow that person to succeed and survive and reproduce and propagate their genes over someone who decides not to help that person build a barn, but spends time building something bigger and better for themselves? It really does seem counterintuitive. It seems like a big problem for the theory of natural selection. So part of what I want to talk to you about today is how morality really can fit very nicely within Darwin's theory of natural selection, and then we can also draw out some implications of this. So first, there's a really important important distinction that we need to draw when we talk about altruism and when we talk about selfishness. So one of Richard Dawkins' big insights was that when we think about evolution, it's not organisms who are trying to survive and reproduce. It's not the organisms themselves that really need to be successful. It's the genes. So the reason that Dawkins titled his book The Selfish Gene is because he thought when we think about evolution, what we really need to do is focus not on the level of the individual, but on the level of the gene. And it's genes that need to outcompete other variations of those same genes, and therefore build more vehicles or more people to harbor those genes and then pass those genes on. And so in general, when we think about selfishness in terms of evolution, we need to think about this in terms of these kinds of anthropomorphic genes, or these genes that, if we want to kind of humanize them or personalize them, are trying to outcompete other kinds of variants so that they can get passed on and passed on and passed on. And so that's the level of selfishness that's really important when we think about evolution and natural selection and the survival of certain variants over others. And so we can make a distinction between genetic altruism and psychological altruism. When we think about genetic altruism, that indicates something in which a gene is not being selfish, again, in this kind of anthropomorphic way. The gene is not doing a good job of outcompeting other variants and then propagating itself such that it's surviving on and on and on. So all of the genes that all of us share in this room today are very selfish genes. These are genes that have successfully outcompeted all of the other variants and have led themselves to have existed for generations and generations and generations at the expense of other genes that haven't been so successful. So genes that have built individuals that aren't as good at surviving and reproducing such that those genes can get passed on. So then some good examples of genetic altruism are things that we wouldn't think of as altruistic in any way ourselves. So we could imagine that if we had certain genetic predispositions to take birth control, that would be an incredibly altruistic set of genes. Those genes would not lead to individuals successfully surviving and reproducing at rates higher than others who are not predisposed to take birth control, for example. Or we could think about genes that might lead us to smoke. or really at the extreme, genes that would lead people to infanticide, something like that. Any kind of genetic predisposition that is going to lead people to act in ways such that their genes have a lower chance of getting passed on are going to be genes that are not going to survive, and therefore those genes are less selfish in Dawkins' sense, they're altruistic. But actions like infanticide are certainly not psychologically altruistic. So there really is a distinction here where things that are genetically altruistic have no real connection to things that are psychologically altruistic. And so this is a really important distinction to make. And so when we're doing something that's truly altruistic at the psychological level or at the behavioral level, when we're doing something that is benefiting others at an expense to ourselves, it's not clear, at least prima facie, that this is going to hurt our genes, that this is going to lead us to have a harder time surviving and reproducing. When we act altruistically as organisms, it's an open question whether or not this is going to be something that's going to lessen the chances of our genes reproducing and replicating themselves, or not. And so this is really the question, is whether psychological altruism, whether people who really genuinely have cooperative tendencies and want to help others out and love others and try to benefit others, whether that kind of disposition is something that is at odds with evolution, with the natural selection of certain genetic variants. And I am going to argue that there are a lot of reasons to think that that's not the case. So altruism can be risky. You certainly take a risk when you act in a way that is going to be at least temporarily costly to you, but beneficial to others. But there's evidence that this can be really evolutionarily stable, that this can be a strategy that can get passed on and replicated. So, for example, you can think about these baboons who are grooming each other. And any baboon that is predisposed to want to groom some other baboon, to do something really kind to this other baboon at an expense to itself, so it's taking away time and energy that it could be spending feeding itself or doing other things for itself, it's choosing to do this for some other individual. But by grooming this other individual, by scratching this other monkey's back, its back is going to get scratched later on. So this other monkey is going to be much more likely to groom this other monkey, pick out bugs in places where it couldn't reach, and so this is going to be a mutually beneficial, cooperative relationship that these monkeys have, that both of them are going to be benefiting more than the kinds of benefits that they could accrue by just trying to act selfishly. And we see this all of the time in human society as well, that corporations, for example, can make quite a huge profit by giving out free samples, because they know that customers, when they taste this sample, are going to feel more obligated to then buy a much larger product and spend money on this. So all of these kinds of mutually beneficial cooperative relationships can actually really be evolutionarily beneficial. If we enter into some kind of cooperative relationship such that someone else can do something for us that we can't do for ourselves, then that's going to end up putting us on top. So by helping others, we can really help ourselves. But I think there are still situations in which you might be hesitant to think that this is the case. So we can think back to Stephen and Sarah from that game show. And in this case, we can imagine that this is Sarah, this is Stephen. So this is someone who tends to have more selfish tendencies. This is someone who tends to have more cooperative tendencies. And in this kind of situation where these two people have one chance to cooperate with one another, it really is the case that, and you can show this through a lot of economic experiments, really the only beneficial to do, the best possible strategy is to cheat. The thing that you are going to guarantee that you're probably not going to get the best outcome for is by trying to cooperate. At best, you'll get half of the money. At worst, you'll get nothing. In the other case, at worst, you'll, basically, you could get everything, even though you're risking getting nothing as well. And you can set this up in lots of different ways, but generally, always in these one-shot kinds of situations, when you're never going to see the person again, it's generally better to cheat, to be selfish. But we live in a society where that's not our typical interaction. We end up seeing people regularly, interacting with them time and time again. And we also live in communities where we get to choose who we want to partner with. We get to choose who we want to form certain cooperative relationships with. And so if we imagine that there's a society that consists of a bunch of more selfish people and a bunch of more cooperative people, as long as we can have some mechanism of knowing that some people are going to have more cooperative tendencies, some people are going to have more selfish tendencies, we can start to choose who we want to partner up with. And in these kinds of cooperative situations, especially when we live in these tight-knit communities where we're going to be seeing people over and over again and we can start to figure out what kind of person someone's going to be, we can know that these are the kinds of people that I'm going to try to partner up with, and these kinds of people are going to be more risky to try to cooperate with. And then once these cooperative individuals start to partner up with each other and start to form these mutually beneficial relationships where they can start to gain from these kinds of cooperations, and then they can also start to ostracize or exclude or punish or otherwise kind of control the behavior of these individuals who tend to be more selfish, then you can start to have some kind of social selection, which operates very similarly to a process of sexual selection, where basically the individuals have this opportunity to choose who they're partnering with, either in a sexual sense or a non-sexual sense. But by entering into these kinds of cooperative relationships with people, or choosing romantic partners who are more cooperative, who are going to stick around longer to help you raise your child or whatever it is, then you can have this really strong selection force for these good, cooperative, altruistic psychological dispositions. And it's actually going to be evolutionarily, genetically selfish to have these psychological, altruistic inclinations. And so what this means is that in our human societies, reputation matters quite a lot. In order for us to figure out who to partner with, who's going to be the best kind of cooperative partner, we place a lot of emphasis on who we can see, how we can see those people, and when we watch other kinds of interactions, we're able to learn and remember who is going to be a good person to cooperate with in the future and who's not going to be. And we also have this incredible adaptation of language, of gossip. And many evolutionary scholars suggest that the whole reason that we have language, the reason that language evolved, was as a mechanism of this partner control, partner choice kind of social selection, that most of our time speaking with one another is spent gossiping about the inclinations of other people to cooperate or not cooperate. And through these kinds of linguistic channels that we have, through these social networks, we can learn about other people's dispositions, we can figure out whether they're going to be cooperative or not, and then we can very quickly, even before meeting somebody, decide whether or not they're going to be a good partner or not. So, because of all of these forces, because of the way that human society is structured, altruism actually doesn't seem to defy natural selection at all. There's actually a lot of good reason to think that morality could have, and very likely did, evolve as a process of natural selection. Any questions at this point before I move on?
If the best strategy is to cheat, wouldn't it be best to join up with someone who is a cheater?
So that's a really great question. And the question for anyone who didn't hear is, if the best strategy is to cheat, wouldn't it be better to join up with other cheaters? So generally, if you think back to the split or steal kind of situation, that if both people decide to split, they get half of the money each. If both people decide to steal, neither one gets anything. The best case scenario is if you steal, if you're able to cheat, and the other person tries to cooperate. So they try to split with you, and then you steal everything. So generally, if you can enter into lots of certain interactions with people who are going to try to cooperate with you, and you're able to selfishly take everything from that interaction, that ends up being a successful strategy in some cases. And So yeah, we can probably think of certain people who use this strategy very successfully.
Oh, yeah.
It's difficult to do that because as soon as you start trying to steal or to defect or to cheat or anything else that would be a negative in a cooperative situation, that's going to start to follow you around. You're going to have a reputation, especially in small societies like the ones that humans spend most of their time in, such that very few people are going to want to cooperate with that cheater in the future. And cheaters cooperating with cheaters is going to never work out very well. Two people who cooperate with one another are always going to overall benefit more than two people who are both trying to get the best of each other all the time. So generally you can get more, even though it's not as much as you could get if you're cooperating, or if you're stealing from someone who's cooperative. If you're cooperating with someone who's cooperative, that's something that's sustainable and something that can keep lasting and get more benefits than if you were to cheat. So thank you. Larry?
What you've explored here, I think Axelrod explored very well in his book, The Evolution of Cooperation.
Mm-hmm.
But what I'm troubled by is you're using the word cooperation as if it's a synonym for altruism. And it's not. I mean, altruism is a selfless concern for others to your own detriment even.
Mm-hmm.
Cooperation, and you've given many, many examples how cooperation is definitely consistent with evolution when there is repetitive interaction. The person who is giving is always getting, and that's the whole point of what Axelrod calls tit for tat is the best strategy. And it even answers the other question of whether it's better to be selfish or not. If there's repetitive interaction, it's better to be selfish once. And then if the other person defects, then you no longer can trust them. But that's a social strategy where there's repeated interaction. But it's all about cooperation. It's not about altruism. And so it doesn't have anything to do with morality.
Okay, so this is really good. And anyone who didn't hear this, what is being said is that there's a big difference between altruism and cooperation. I shouldn't be conflating these two terms. And often when we cooperate with someone, we know that we're going to get a benefit later on. So it could be temporarily altruistic. We're doing something at a cost to ourselves in the moment to help someone else, but we know that we're going to get a benefit later on. I think this certainly exists on a continuum. And in many cases, I think altruism is part of cooperation, that there's a necessity to be altruistic when you are the person acting in a cooperative relationship. So part of what it means to cooperate, often at least, is that you're taking a risk or taking a cost momentarily to help somebody else out, but then often have the knowledge that they're going to help you out again in the future.
At least the hope.
Yeah, at least the hope, but it's not for certain, which is important. But also in many of these kinds of situations, if you are the type of person who is acting truly altruistically, that it's not a cooperative relationship, but it's just that you are the kind of person who's going to donate money to somebody or to help somebody who's suffering on the street, or to do something that truly is good, that you're not expecting any kind of benefit in the future, and you probably don't get any benefit in the future. That kind of reciprocity ends up usually circling back in a much more indirect way. So rather than this kind of direct one-on-one reciprocity where you have a relationship with one other person, what happens in these kinds of situations is that other people observe these good actions often, other people talk about these good actions that you're engaging in often, and that will benefit that person reputationally such that they end up becoming sort of a person who other people want to help out in the future, who they want to be part of their community, a partner of theirs, and so on and so forth. So there ends up being reciprocity that potentially that person who's being altruistic doesn't expect in any kind of way. And it's often going to come back in ways that they don't realize. But by acting in ways that are more kind of definitionally pure forms of altruism, where you really give up something, costs or time or something like that, momentarily, usually based on the fact that we live in these really close-knit communities and can talk about each other a lot, that often ends up benefiting people, or it seems like that could be a successful evolutionary strategy.
I'm not trying to prolong this, and I'm not intending to, but I will just give you an example that you might want to think about another time. And I use it because I'm a doctor and because someone on the faculty is an example, and that's donating a kidney. That is a purely altruistic act.
I get chocolate every year. Every year I get chocolate.
I didn't know you were here.
Yeah, so I think this is, if I can pick on you, a really great example that Annalisa Cornell is an extreme altruist in many ways, and does things, it seems at least out of the goodness of your heart, without any idea about how this could benefit you at all in the future. And generally that is the mark of true altruism, that people are doing something not with selfish motives, but really because they are good people, they're doing good things, they're doing sometimes extremely good things, like donating a kidney or adopting children or doing other things that don't necessarily benefit them. And this is, again, going to be kind of a generalization that I'm talking about. So overall, it seems like these kinds of actions are going to come back to benefit people. Everyone loves Professor Cornell. And so people can kind of get this good reputation and become really successful by doing these altruistic things in the moment, even if it's not going to come back immediately in any kind of way. But I think you are pointing out a good point that I need to put an asterisk on this conclusion. There are a lot of caveats here, a lot of nuances that I don't necessarily have time to get into now, and certainly there are a lot of components of morality that aren't directly the products of natural selection, so a lot of specific moral beliefs we need other kinds of explanations for. But overall, at least these kinds of tendencies to be good to one another, whether that's through kind of direct cooperation or through more pure kinds of altruism, can have and very likely did evolve through natural selection. But what this means is that we're going to not necessarily always be the kinds of extreme altruists that some people end up being, that a minority of people end up being. Because we evolved our morality in such a way that it would benefit us, that it would be kind of genetically selfish. And so this ends up having certain kinds of caveats. So for example, the moral sense tends to be directed toward people who are in our communities, who we will end up benefiting from later on down the line, whether they're direct cooperative partners or whether they're people who will just know about our reputation and have the chance to cooperate with us in the future. But generally, people who are part of our group, however that group is defined, are the people who end up kind of being within that circle of moral concern that we have. So an old psychological study showed that just by putting people into really artificial groups, you can get them to kind of morally align with one another and see people who aren't part of that group as enemies. So you can take school children and put them into groups of eagles and rattlers, and just by virtue of being in those groups, the eagles become really cooperative with one another and start seeing the rattlers as terrible people and people who they want to compete with, and vice versa. And generally, morality is largely about creating these groups within which we share a lot of bonds, we're very cooperative toward these kinds of individuals, but this also leads to ostracism, exclusion, sometimes even hate toward people who aren't within that group and aren't perceived as deserving of those kinds of group loyalties or cooperative tendencies. And generally, any kind of group, any kind of large-scale group that we have tends to have certain parochial kinds of moral norms even. So moral norms that really only apply within that group. So for example, many Jewish people think that it's really morally important for everyone in that group to stay kosher and to abide by certain kinds of norms, but not necessarily for people outside that. And even children, by the age that they're 3, think that even if there was no rule against hitting, that it's still really wrong for someone to hit or beat up someone who's a member of their same group. But if there's no rule against hitting, they're a little more forgiving for someone who's beating up someone who's not a member of that same group. So even children kind of think about moral norms as only extending to the boundaries of a particular group, not necessarily being universal in the way that we would like moral norms generally to be.
was wondering if you could analogize this to management style, where you have the treacherous CEO who takes advantage of everybody and is always very bold about it and becomes very successful at it. His whole strategy is cheating and undermining others to get ahead. So wouldn't that be an argument for against altruism, or consistent with your original thought that cheating is a good strategy?
Yeah, so certainly there are counterexamples. There's a lot of individual variation. There are still a lot of differences in how people act, and there's room often in many species to have different kinds of strategies. And as long as those strategies are kind of proportionally distributed across the population, different kinds of strategies can be beneficial for different kinds of people, and they can kind of carve out their own sort of niches within those societies. But it does seem like overall, in general, most people have a strong moral sense that they do develop. Many people are very averse to cheating and stealing and lying and things like that. And so I think we can explain that in large part through the benefits that would have created for many, many generations in the past. But that's not going to apply to everyone. There's always going to be some individual differences there.
Might be good to hold the rest of the questions until the end.
Okay, perfect. So another aspect of our moral sense, given that it is at least partially, potentially largely the product of evolution, is that it's often very irrational. It's often driven by intuitions, by emotions, by beliefs and values that we haven't spent a lot of time kind of thinking about and carefully considering. And I think one great example of this is in donations to charity. It seems potentially to many of you that these two charities are potentially good, equal charities to donate to. So in this first case, there are many cases in which people skydive or parachute jump in order to support certain charities. So for example, this is a skydive that's helping a health service, and by people engaging in these skydives, or similar things happen with marathons or things like that, you raise money by doing something that's really hard. And by parachute jumping or by running 26 miles or something like that, you can raise money for some cause, for some charity. Or you could potentially, without having any sort of cost to oneself or any sort of martyrdom, raise money, for example, for the Against Malaria Foundation for for mosquito nets that are treated with insecticide to prevent malaria. So in many cases, a lot of people think that these first kinds of charities are really great to donate to, even though in this particular example, it actually seems like cost-benefit analyses show that this comes at a net cost. So in one study, at least, of these kinds of parachute jumping charities, that was raising money for the National Health Service in Scotland, for every pound that was raised by these parachute jumpers, by these people who jumped out of planes to raise money, the National Health Service had to spend £13.75 to treat parachute-related injuries. So this was at a huge cost to the National Health Services, and yet people kept donating to these charities and engaging in them. It's not the most effective way to raise money, not the most effective use of money. And so we tend to kind of focus on this behavior of giving as being really good, and see altruism generally, regardless of how it operates, as this really upstanding thing. But our moral sense isn't necessarily calibrated to really reason carefully about where our money is moving in the most effective kinds of ways. And finally, the moral sense is really short-sighted. So if the moral sense evolved in such a way that it allowed us to work with people in our communities and to have these kinds of cooperative partnerships, then it would stand to reason that many of our moral intuitions and beliefs would also kind of follow suit. So I want to present just a quick thought experiment from the philosopher Peter Singer. And I want you all to imagine that you have just bought a really beautiful, nice suit. And this suit has been tailored to you. It fits really nicely. And after you've just spent a few $100s on this, it looks so good on you, you like it so much that you decide to wear it home. And as you're walking home wearing this suit, you walk on this sidewalk that goes around a pond. And as you're walking around this pond, you see in the middle of this pond a child who's drowning. Now you have a choice. You can either jump into the pond and save this child, or at least try to save this child, or you can preserve your suit. How many people think that you have a moral obligation to jump in and save the child? All right, and keep your hands up as long as you feel like you have this obligation. So imagine now that there are a lot of other people on this sidewalk, a lot of other people who have seen this child and could be jumping in to save this child but are choosing not to. How many people still feel like you have the obligation to save the child? And now imagine that your swimming skills are not amazing. They're good enough that you know you're not going to drown. You're not putting yourself at risk in any way by jumping into this pond. But you're not really certain that you're going to successfully swim out to this child and save the child and bring this child back to shore. So you're not putting yourself at risk, but you're not really sure that your efforts are going to be productive. Do you still have an obligation to jump in and try to save the child? So many people still feel this way. And then what Peter Singer wants us to consider is whether or not we also feel like we have an obligation to, instead of having bought that suit in the first place, to have spent those several $100s on saving children in sub-Saharan Africa who are dying every day of preventable diseases, of hunger, of malaria, of other kinds of things. We could, instead of buying suits, be spending this money to go to effective, transparent charities that we know are going to be saving children's lives. And just reflect on whether or not you still feel like you have this obligation. For many people, this feeling is diminished. And it's really hard to explain why. So some people say, well, it's not right in front of me. There are other people who could be doing the same kind of thing, but you also think there are other people on the sidewalk around the pond. You also aren't positive that the money is going to be used in the right way, but similarly, you're not positive that your efforts to save the child are going to pay off. So a lot of these kinds of arguments for why these cases are different just kind of fall flat. And it seems like, in the end, the reason that we feel this really strong obligation to save the drowning child is because this child is right there, up close and personal, part of our community, and so our empathy goes out to this child. Whereas when people are living many, many communities away, we start to feel less empathy, our obligations toward them begin to diminish, and this is, again, probably not the kind of moral sense that we would wish ourselves to have. And so what this means is that although we have evolved certain kinds of moral intuitions, there are certain kinds of moral values and moral goals that many of us have that just are not consistent with the way that the moral sense tends to work. So because of this kind of moral myopia, we don't seem wired to be humanitarians. We tend to see the world in such a way such that right around us we see a lot of detail, a lot of nuance, a lot of humanity, and then beyond our communities things begin to kind of fade. And so for anyone who came to the Common Hour that Paul Bloom gave last year, he really argues that we need to get rid of empathy because what empathy does is it allows us to pour our hearts out toward people who look like us, or who are in our communities, or who share our beliefs or values, or skin color, or religion, or anything like that. And we tend not to have those same kinds of responses in other cases. So we put tons and tons and tons of money to save baby Jessica and successfully saved this child from a well, but people don't feel the same obligation to put lots and lots of money into saving many, many more children in other places around the world. And again, because of this kind of tribal nature of our moral sense, we tend to rally around ideals that are parochial, that aren't going to expand to a love of all humanity, but are going to be, in many cases, about people who are like us, who are part of our tribe. And so for many kinds of social justice issues or human rights issues, we need to really work to broaden our typical kinds of moral intuitions in order to expand them in the ways that we might want to have them expanded. Similarly, if we care about sustainability in the environment, it seems like our moral intuitions are also not wired in such a way to allow us to have really strong moral concerns about that. So for many people, there would be no kind of moral guilt or shame or anything like that to go out and buy a hamburger, even though the production of this hamburger has led to cows emitting methane and also being slaughtered in often pretty horrible ways. And we're so distant from these kinds of things that they just don't resonate with our moral sense. And so eating a hamburger doesn't feel like a morally bad thing to do. When we see someone eating a hamburger, most people wouldn't judge that person as a bad person or anything like that. This is just not something that morally resonates with most people. Same thing as if we were having a Keurig cup and throwing the cup into the trash or other kinds of plastic away. We're not seeing the consequences of these actions, and because of that, we don't feel guilty. We don't think that this is a moral wrong. Or if we go on a plane to take a vacation or visit family or do something good on this plane ride, we also would never or very rarely think of the kinds of carbon emissions from this plane as being something that would make this act really morally problematic. And again, in all of these cases, the effects are so distant, and the people who are feeling these kinds of effects are also people who are marginalized and living in communities that many of us don't necessarily see or witness. We're just not having that kind of immediate empathy, as if there was a child drowning in the pond right in front of us. The destruction that is going to be caused by all of these behaviors is so far away and so impersonal and caused by the collection of so many different people that our moral sense just doesn't resonate with this. So overall, I think we have evolved this moral sense. We do have these moral beliefs and moral intuitions, but it's not perfect. It's not designed for a species that would care about other humans who we would never meet around the world, who don't have any impact on our reputation in any kind of way, or on other kinds of acts that don't influence cooperation or the propagation of our genes. But I think there is a lot of room to leverage the science of moral psychology to use what we know about the moral mind to really create certain kinds of interventions and move toward a future such that the moral arc really does bend toward justice. So we can use some of these insights about our tendencies to affiliate with other members of our groups to create, for example, jigsaw classrooms where people of a bunch of different backgrounds have to work together in order to accomplish some kind of goal. So you're leading to people to cooperate with each other in order to succeed in something that is going to benefit everyone, and therefore work with other people from, again, different ethnicities, different religions, different whatever it is, and by doing that they become part of a unified group, and you can sort of expand people's sense of who is us in these kinds of ways. If we want to try to facilitate environmentalism, we can try to make these things more up close and personal, try to facilitate people's feelings of empathy, for example, by telling them stories of people who already are being impacted by droughts and by some of the implications of climate change, or potentially some of the animals, and really direct people's attention to the kinds of consequences that their own behaviors might be having on these kinds of things. We can get people to think about future generations, and therefore people who are very close to us or who we have ties to, who will be impacted by these kinds of things. So we can use these sorts of insights to really start to design carefully certain kinds of interventions that are going to help facilitate certain kinds of moral goals. We might also want to get rid of certain anonymous forums, such that people's reputations are more at stake in many cases, or people are more observable. People have to take more accountability for what they're doing. By doing this, people will tend to act in more cooperative ways. And I think in general, sort of being the change that we want to see in the world and acting in certain kinds of ways and creating communities that have certain kinds of norms such that what it means to have a good reputation in those communities shifts. This can also, I think, have really beneficial cascading effects. So overall, I just want to close by suggesting that we really can use the tools of evolution and our insights into how the moral sense might have been naturally selected to leverage certain kinds of tendencies that might be good, to potentially hamper other tendencies that we might expect would come up in certain kinds of situations. And just by learning about the theory of evolution and how evolution might impact morality is really going to give us some special tools. So evolution is going to end up creating these kinds of myopias or parochialisms or irrationalities, these kinds of biases, in anyone who hasn't taken the time to think about how these biases might be created or hasn't taken the time to challenge these biases. But I think by knowing about them, by learning about them, we can really stop, pause, and consider these biases more carefully. So thank you all very much for coming. And I skipped you before, so I'll take your question.
The latter part of your talk dealt a good bit of examples of choices people make. And I noticed all the choices that people raise their hands for are absolute choices. The child lives or the child dies. And environmental morality, even public health morality, is incremental. Yes, I can donate the value of the suit to cure malaria, but we still have malaria. And I don't think we have a moral sense when it comes to these, where we contribute to things incrementally. I mean, the people who brought us the Holocaust, many of them were just little cogs in the wheels, and they never realized the total effect of their little incremental contribution there. You know, the banality of evil. And on the good side, too, we don't recognize the good of not flying or not eating hamburgers. So why don't we have a stronger moral sense of choices we make where the outcomes are incremental, is my question, I guess.
So this is a really great question. And in general, I think when we think about the kinds of people we would punish, or the kinds of people we would ostracize, or the kinds of people who we would stop choosing as partners in cooperation, it's going to be the kinds of people who have produced really quantifiable, obvious kinds of bad outcomes. So they've stolen, they've murdered, they've done something that has really obviously, tangibly created some kind of negative outcome. And when people are merely a cog in the wheel or one point in the causal chain that's 5 points before something is ever going to actually happen, it's a lot harder to place blame on somebody, to punish somebody, and then to stop cooperating with them. So I think the kinds of mechanisms that tend to fuel that sort of partner choice or partner control often kind of tie in with the kinds of things that we can say this person is good because of that good action, or this person is bad because of that particular bad action that produced that bad outcome. And when it's more diffuse, it's just harder to do that. So thank you. Pablo, and then Tom.
Okay, so you made a big leap when you said, moralities evolve because that means it's genetically encoded, whatever. But my question is, so do you think what's evolved, the ability to have a moral judgment or selfishness versus altruism? As an analogy, we all evolved to be able to use language, but which language we use is entirely depending on context.
Mm-hmm. Great. So potentially there's some sort of deep structure of morality or some kind of skeleton that we all share, that we all have certain kinds of aversions to harm or aversions to unfairness, or certain kind of basic principles of morality that might be either directly encoded in the genes or more likely something is encoded in the genes that builds people who are more apt to learn certain kinds of things and develop in particular kinds of ways to have certain dispositions, but certainly the environment is going to always be interacting with all of this, and so a lot of the nuances, a lot of the details, a lot of the specifics of what we think are morally wrong, or the specifics of what it means to have a good reputation, or how to act in the morally right way, is going to be hugely culturally, contextually dependent. So it seems likely that, yeah, we have these predispositions to act in cooperative ways, at least in certain kinds of situations when other people in our groups are involved. But those can be stretched, or they can be restricted, or they can be shaped in a lot of different ways, depending on how children are raised, I think.
Josh, can you comment on the actual connection between genetic sequence, in other words, DNA, and the moral sense?
No. So certainly there are huge leaps, I think, as Pablo also pointed out, and as several of you, Larry, also pointed out. I think, yeah, certainly there are a lot of big inferences that we're making. There's a lot of interdisciplinary work that needs to be done in kind of connecting down. There's some great work being done on certain kinds of hormones and the links between at least hormones and certain behavioral tendencies and how that might impact the moral sense. We have not gone deeper than that, really. There are some indications that certain SNPs are going to lead to people focusing a little bit more on kind of consequentialism versus deontology. There's very, very little research on actual genetic sequences that are going to lead to this, so a lot more work needs to be done. Yes?
I think the previous two questions touch on my question, but in the beginning you made a distinction between genetic altruism and psychological altruism. Is there really a difference? I mean, aren't they both genetic?
Yeah, great question. And when I talk about psychological altruism, or when other scientists talk about psychological altruism, generally they are suggesting that it could be, at least in part, a product of genes. But the focus of analysis, or the phenomenon that we're focused on, is the psychology or the behavior. So we're looking to see whether a particular behavior is going to be costly to an individual, it's going to deplete their energy, or it's going to do something in order to benefit somebody else. And so it's kind of at the macro level, we can describe certain kinds of beliefs or behaviors as being altruistic, regardless of the cause of those behaviors. So it could be something that is genetically hardwired and instinctual. It could be something that is entirely culturally learned. Generally, everything's going to be something in between. But the cause of those things is less of an issue when you're focusing on just describing whether something is or is not selfish or altruistic at the psychological level. And then same is true for the genetic level, how those genes came to be. I guess because in part that's a definition of genetic selfishness, that matters a little bit more. But generally, to be genetically selfish, it means that those genes are going to be, on average, outcompeting other variants of those same genes. So it's more just kind of describing whether or not having that kind of trait or having those base pairs are going to probabilistically lead to some kind of outcome. Yes?
I have a question about the redemption of the cheaters. Early on when you were talking about after the quiz show, how cooperators will tend to pair off and group off, and then the cheaters will keep being the lone wolves out there taking advantage of everyone. That's a kind of a grim future because it suggests no bridging of the divide. So my question is, can cheaters be redeemed? And specifically, what is the role of forgiveness on the part of the cooperators toward cheaters? And how do you know when to forgive?
Really good question. Generally, I think these aren't going to be inherently stable things, so being a cheater or not being a cheater is going to be something that certainly can change in people, and people can forgive and be redeemed, and we have examples of that. In general, we tend to want to punish people in ways that aren't actually going to rehabilitate or will end up leading to people being more productive members of society or more likely to cooperate. Sometimes there is that effective punishment, but we tend to have really retributive, punitive intuitions that, again, I think is a bias of the way that our morality has evolved that doesn't necessarily easily lend itself to people being welcomed back into society. I'll go with you and we can circle back.
One concept that I haven't heard spoken of here today is group selection. Group selection is a way to explain that if your group has too many cheaters and not enough cooperators, it will not hold its place well among other groups. So that, I was almost surprised that you didn't go there. Another comment I have to make is that you're either a hero or a fool to try to do this topic in an hour, but I think you deserve a lot of credit for trying. There's a book called Strangers Drowning. Are you aware of that?
Yeah.
It tries to explain the downside of this wonderful concept that we can all be humanitarian and act thoroughly and completely around the world. It gives examples of people who in essence destroyed themselves, their relationships, and their groups by, a common term would be overextending.
Thank you. So Darwin's favorite explanation for the existence of morality was group selection in the end. And other people, currently a guy named David Sloan Wilson, really advocates for this. There are a few others who advocate for it. Most people tend not to, and the reason for that is that generally, so the idea of group selection is that if you have one really cooperative group over here and one really uncooperative group over here, that we are all, as a cooperative group, going to work better together, we're going to build barns for each other, we're going to do all these other things for each other that are going to end up causing our group to be better than that group, and so as a group, we can outcompete that group. The issue that makes group selection really tough and untenable outside of eusocial insects that share quite a lot of their genes is that people, if we have this really cooperative group, and we're all we have these ultra cooperative tendencies, and I tend to defect and steal and cheat, then I'm going to do better in this group overall, at least potentially, if we don't have these ideas of social selection and things like that that are going to influence individual fitness. If the idea is that at the individual level being competitive is going to be the best strategy, then as soon as you have competitive, selfish people kind of impinging on this group, then they're going to overwhelm that group and take over. And so it seems that in most cases for natural selection to work, it has to be advantageous at the level of the individual's genes rather than at the level of the group. Some people disagree. I tend to, again, I wish we had more than an hour to focus on all of this, but yeah, generally, I think most people feel that if we can have an individual selection explanation, that that's going to be more robust. And because we only have time for one more question, I'll skip Strangers Drowning, although I do think that's a really excellent book.
Professor Rottman, we discussed during our radio discussion about, I think briefly we brought up the idea of the political versus the conservative brain, and I think you sort of dismissed that, but I listened to a study yesterday that said that that conservatives have a higher fear and disgust response. Is that, the two-pronged question, can that be predicted hereditarily? And also, is that another lab studies showing that conservatives in regards to climate change are going to be a lot more fond of individual solutions, while a person who is liberal will likely having more a collective solution? How do we reconcile that, all that tribalism and the way our brains work?
Yeah, great question again. So So a lot more research needs to be done to connect really the genetic level up to a lot of this kind of macro theorizing that psychologists are mostly stuck with right now. So generally we can form these arguments for why we think that certain things probably evolved in certain kinds of ways. We don't necessarily have the genetic evidence to suggest that. We do know at a psychological level that conservatives and liberals differ in certain kinds of personality tendencies, emotional tendencies, things like that. And it is true that conservatives on average tend to be higher in disgust and fear to some extent. We don't know if they're genetic predictors of that. But yeah, it does seem like there are these kind of different strategies, again, that can potentially work. Conservatives tend to have a strategy where they focus very intensely on their social networks, and so conservatives tend to have stronger family ties, stronger community ties, stronger concern for people who are within their neighborhoods and communities, whereas liberals tend to be kind of more diffuse in their moral concern. So it's not as strong for people who are close to them, but it spreads out farther. And the explanation for that, I think, is still pretty up in the air. Is it time to stop, or should we take... Okay. All right, well, thank you all so much for being here.